Welcome everyone to today's session on humanitarianism and solidarity in the digital age, organised by the Caston Centre for Human Rights Law. Before we begin, on behalf of all present today, I would like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we've gathered today from across the world, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. I'd like to start today's session with a brief introduction of our speakers, and then my co-chair Fleur will briefly run through the usual mechanics for these kinds of sessions, so how to participate via chat, etc. So we have a very talented panel of speakers today. Firstly, we have Johannes Ayalou, who is a PhD candidate at the Monash Law School in Melbourne, Australia, in freedom of expression, privacy and the internet. Welcome also to Karin Froda, who is also a PhD candidate at Monash Law School and whose research is looking at the role of solidarity in international law. Karin is also a contributor to an upcoming research handbook on solidarity and international law. Our third panelist today is Associate Professor Maria O'Sullivan of Monash University, whose research is focused on public law, human rights and refugee law. And Maria is also the Deputy Director of Research at the Caston Centre. Finally, we will also be joined shortly by our final panelist, Sarah Wahidi, who's on her way, who is a founder and CEO of Etisab, Afghanistan's first civic technology startup. Sarah is also studying at Columbia University in New York. As for myself, my name is Madeline Hale, and I will be one of your co-chairs for this session. I'm a PhD candidate in free speech, democracy, and social media at Deakin Law School, which is also in Melbourne, Australia. And as mentioned, my wonderful co-chair today is Professor Fleur Chance. Fleur is a professor at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. And Fleur works in international law, legal theory, and law and technology. I'll now pass you over to Fleur to give you a quick rundown on the mechanics of the session today.
Thanks, Madeline, and hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here for this panel. We're really keen to encourage you to get involved. So if you have questions or comments that you would like to put to the panel, please do so in the chat box. Please bear in mind that everything we say here is governed by, or we're proceeding under what you may know as the Chatham House rule, meaning that anything said here can be shared outside this panel, provided that no one is identified by name or affiliation, so no participant. If there's some remark made here is shared externally, it shouldn't be attributed to a particular person. That's in the interests of making sure the conversation flows freely and everyone feels comfortable in saying what they'd like to say. When you do put your questions in the chat box, please, if you would like to, say who you are and perhaps where you're from, if that just helps us understand who's involved in this conversation and also maybe the basis for perhaps further conversations down the road. We might be able to get in touch with you if you're interested in further discussions. But we understand that not everyone feels comfortable, and that's fine too. So if you prefer not to, that's okay. If you do tweet about this event, we'd invite you to use one of the hashtags that will help people find it. So either hashtag RightsCon or perhaps hashtag digital humanitarianism or digital solidarity. One of these terms that connects not only to the event as a whole, but to this panel specifically. But without further ado, you really want to hear from our panelists. So I'll hand back to Madeline to get the conversation started. And I really hope to hear from as many participants via the chat box. Thanks.
Thanks, Fleur. So before we start, I think it's important to firstly frame the discussion we're about to have by firstly defining what we actually mean by the term solidarity that some of us may not be as familiar with, and certainly quite a nebulous term at times. So I'd firstly like to ask Karin in particular, what is solidarity, and is it a concept that can even be defined?
Thank you, Madeline. Just checking that you can hear me okay. Perfect. So solidarity really has become somewhat of a buzzword in recent years. It's often called upon as the solution to all the global crises that we are facing today. And it is a word that has and continues to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people in a lot of different contexts. So I think it is very difficult, if not impossible, to find a definition that we can all agree upon. And so for attendees here today, do please post in the chat what solidarity means to you and for your work. We'd be very interested to hear from you on that and get your input as well. In the context of RightsCon, we've all gathered today, arguably in the spirit of solidarity, to find ways to further human rights in the digital age. So I think a useful starting point in the human rights context is the work of the UN Independent Expert on Human Rights and International Solidarity, which has come up with a working definition of solidarity, which is a spirit of unity, being a union of interest, purposes, and actions among a range of different actors, individuals, peoples, states, and international organizations. And I think to this list of actors as well, very importantly, is also private actors, including tech companies as well. Another important thing which the UN mandate is doing is that it specifies that it is seeking to further solidarities that further or at least align with human rights. I think there is often an assumption that solidarity is inherently a good thing. But of course, there may be solidarities or unities that seek to exclude, to discriminate, to spread violence. And so I think it's important to recognize this distinction. And I think that's a useful starting point for us talking about it in the human rights context.
Great, thanks so much, Karen. I think that's a really helpful starting point. And please feel free, our participants here today, to include in the chat what solidarity means to you, perhaps, if that's of interest. I think that's a good starting point to go into a first sort of general question that I'll put to the panel at large, which is, how does this concept of solidarity differ in the online digital age when compared to the offline world? Specifically, how do experiences, concerns, or prospects for solidarity differ, if they are in fact different at all, or are we looking at the same thing that we see in the offline world? And I might throw to Maria here.
Yes, so my background is refugee law, and solidarity has been quite controversial in that area because states talk about responsibility sharing. So of the 25 million refugees currently in the world, only 1% get resettlement, that is protection. And so the approach is that if we technically want responsibility sharing and solidarity in the refugee space, that means all states should get together and cooperate. And there have been various mechanisms like the Global Compact on Refugees and Migration to try and get states to take responsibility. So for instance, ideally, we would have Australia taking, 50,000 refugees, etc. So their fair share. In the digital space, what this can sometimes mean is the sharing of data, technically to enable refugees to get humanitarian assistance by the UN High Commissioner of Refugees, but also to facilitate the identification of refugees to make refugee status determination quicker. One of the big problems with dealing with refugee flows is that often refugees don't have a passport or other identification. That can sometimes be difficult when there's an age question. So an unaccompanied minor who doesn't have a passport, there's an issue about how we, whether they're of age or underage, and that's very important for dealing with them. So with the digital context, what we can see is there are a couple of concerns about the vulnerability of refugees. If we do give them a digital identity at the border, can that facilitate swapping between countries? There's a mechanism in the EU for that. And then also, if someone's digital identity is incorrect, so we have an unaccompanied minor who should be given special protections, yet they are identified as being above the age of 18, that can have flow-on effects in terms of how they're treated. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. And if any of our other panelists want to jump in at this point on this issue of if it's different online or offline.
Yes, thank you, Mari. Basically, in context of human rights law, the idea of digital solidarity could mean at least three things. The first thing is like the same rights people have offline must be protected online. This is the so-called normative equivalency paradigm. We will apply the same rights for third generation right in the digital space, such as people's self-determination, access to natural resources, and also all other access to the internet. The second aspects of digital solidarity is related with a kind of technological access, such as access to the internet itself, to the marginalized communities and unrepresented communities. So this is another aspect or another dimension of digital solidarity. And the third one is the right not to be subjected to automation or automated decision making. So, for instance, in connection to what Maria has said, for instance, refugees have the right to be protected from kind of automated decision making or something AI decision making. So all these three interconnected rights could mean digital solidarity. More specifically, in the African human rights system, as well as in the European Union system, we have emerging norms that digital solidarity should be protected as a human right. For instance, in 2021, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights has made a landmark resolution, and it has made clear that solidarity should be protected in the digital space, and in particular, values such as Ubuntu, Ujema, and other aspects of unity in Africa, traditional societies should be protected in the digital ecosystem. Yeah, thank you.
If I could just say something following those great comments. One of the issues with the use of digital identity in automated systems with refugees is the ability to challenge anything. So having some redress mechanism, which goes back to Johannes's point about human rights. There is a right to an effective remedy. So that's very important in a digital environment.
Fantastic. I'll jump in there as well. So really, really important comments made there. And I think already we're starting to talk about some of the challenges as well. And I think we need to think about how can we identify these sort of novel challenges for solidarity and for the enjoyment of human rights in the digital age. So in terms of how unity might differ in the online space, I'd say perhaps not so much the definition of solidarity, whatever that might be, but rather sort of the ways in which solidarities form. And so I think a useful distinction here might be to help us also identify challenges would be to look at the digital sphere as a means through which solidarities form, and also as an environment that affects the content of those solidarities that's formed online or as a result of online interactions. So I think we could, if we recognize it as something that is a means for solidarities to form, I think access, which Johannes has already mentioned and which Maria's touched upon as well, is a really key challenge, right? So not everyone, billions of people, in fact, still remain without connectivity. So that's a really, really important challenge, and that will affect who will be able to form solidarities online. And also thinking about perhaps connectivity in a broader sense as meaningful connectivity. So that might also inspire some of our conversations today. What does that mean? You know, does it mean more than simply having the access to the infrastructure and the sort of hardware, but also thinking about having relevant software, having skills to be able to meaningfully enjoy connectivity, but also turning, I think, really importantly as well upon this aspect of identity formation and the digital sphere impacting on the content of solidarities, I think we really need to turn to also the sort of the digital system itself and how it is formed and upon whose terms and conditions that we are interacting online. And I think there are some really interesting and important developments there, for example, in the African human rights system, which I'm sure Johannes will talk further about. I think Sarah has now joined us as well. So keen to hear from you, Sarah, as well. Anyway.
Thank you so much, everyone. I will be joining by video shortly. I just had a little bit of trouble with my commute, but thank you so much again for inviting me to the panel. And yes, definitely we'll be speaking more upon the Afghan context and the way that we are utilizing technology to record and collate human rights violations in that area currently.
Perhaps we'll turn to that then, Sarah, because I think the audience probably has a great sense of how much social, political, and economic life around the globe is being affected by digital technology, but not everyone might understand the detail of how humanitarian work is being transformed, how the way people seek to deliver humanitarian assistance or people seek to obtain humanitarian assistance might be changing. So I guess I would like all the panel to speak to these transformations and what particular risks or opportunities they might present. And since Sarah, you got the ball rolling, maybe we'll start with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Fleur. Well, for right now, of course, humanitarian aid has significantly shifted in the method that it's being allocated. Obviously, just due to the Taliban takeover, the United Nations continues to be the main mechanism for humanitarian support, but we are seeing the use of technology with multiple platforms, like, for example, the Asil app, which has been crowdsourcing donations and aid packages from not only the Afghan diaspora, but across the world, who have been providing funding and providing donations for humanitarian aid on the ground, because it is crowdsourced. These are young Afghan youth who are volunteering their time to take these remittances and disperse them directly to those on the ground. It follows a very different framework than how aid would be dispersed with the United Nations. But that's one example that I can think of right off the top of my head. But there are multiple methods of innovative ways of allocating assistance, humanitarian aid response. And another thing is that the usual mechanisms, usually there's about 1.5 to 2 years of a lag when it comes to budgets and the allocating of funding. So the innovative methodology of how humanitarian aid and assistance is being allocated now is definitely unprecedented in the area, especially with the use of technology and the global community coming together. But definitely it has leveraged the ability to provide assistance in Afghanistan, is these innovative approaches which have been spearheaded not only by the Afghan diaspora, but those who genuinely care about what is going on in the country.
And what risks, if any, are you seeing emerging, bearing in mind some of the remarks that Maria and Karen were making about risks of disputes over identification or questions of exclusion or difficulty accessing these kinds of platforms? Have you observed any things like that?
Of course, one is definitely the inequitability of access to humanitarian aid for those who do not have not only a smartphone, but just access to any reliable communication device, which is becoming more difficult with the lack of electricity and increasing cellular prices in Afghanistan currently. That's one aspect of inequitability that's happening when it comes to disbursement of humanitarian aid. Another one is also just women, is the fact that they are unable to, their mobility has been shifted so drastically that they are unable to reach humanitarian aid in the way that they usually would be able to. Most men allow their wives and their oldest daughters to reach humanitarian aid hubs, but now with the Taliban, it's much more difficult. So we are seeing, I would say, in those aspects, these 2 points of inequitability that are worsening humanitarian aid response.
Thank you, Sarah. I'd like to throw to anyone else in the panel who'd like to come in on this point.
If I could just speak, I guess, to the positives and negatives. So in a positive way, going back to Karen's point, I think refugee communities, so from the bottom up, can use social media and other things like Signal and Telegram to make links with one another across jurisdictions to get assistance. And so the development of solidarity in a bottom-up way between refugee communities is very, I think, has been enhanced by the digital world. So that's a positive. In terms of risks and negatives, one issue that I look at is privacy. And we don't often think about the right of refugees to privacy, because I think we look at refugees perhaps, what some people do, simply as beneficiaries of humanitarianism, and not wholly as agents, you know, people with agency. And this is a bit of a dispute in relation to humanitarian aid and refugee protection. Should refugees have more agency in relation to the country that they ultimately settle in? So when we look at digital humanitarianism, one of the things is, should refugees be compelled to give up their digital information? Now, of course, that can be important in terms of their nationality and their date of birth, etc. So private information that they have to give to international organisations or states in order to get the humanitarian assistance that they need. I would just flag that there is a debate about the consent, the informed consent. Do refugees who are coming from traumatized backgrounds actually understand that in the future that personal information may be used in refugee status determination, as Fleur said, to exclude them from certain countries? Because, for example, if a refugee arrives in Greece and then they have what we call secondary movement and they go to the Netherlands or Germany, that digital identity can be used to transfer them back to the country that they first entered the EU. And so I think there needs to be more education done to ensure that refugees actually understand the ramifications of giving up some of their personal information.
Thanks, Maria. Karen or Johannes?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So really good points. I think, yeah, thinking about maybe benefits and challenges sort of going hand in hand. I'm really interested to explore further, perhaps throwing the ball back to Sarah about this issue of trust and building trust in the digital environment, because I think that is really crucial for solidarity. And it's something that I think, one, is enhanced because of the sort of technological solutions that Maria was saying, that refugees and others on the ground might be able to communicate and build solidarity from the ground up. But we've also seen the sort of digital space as well being an environment which is often co-opted for harmful practices, and the sort of the digital operating system really furthering those type of harmful practices online. So things like, most dire situations, things like the situation in Afghanistan, there have been many reports of scams, families seeking to evacuate Afghanistan, and there have been multiple scams going around whereby people's data has been abused, or there have been promises about evacuations that haven't happened, and with really extreme results as well as a result of that. So I think this issue of trust is really key, and yeah, I'm keen to hear the other participants' thought on that as well, and that being a challenge in the digital sphere.
Johannes, do you want to come in?
course, as Karin earlier highlighted, the issue of, for instance, trust and also inclusion is important in relation to vulnerable groups, and also importantly, in conflict situations, media literacy is at, a meager stage. So we need to work on media literacy and also information literacy for vulnerable communities so that they can easily access what that means in the digital environment.
Perhaps since Karen invited Sarah to speak to this, what would trust mean in the Afghan context? Trust in these platforms, what does it require, Sarah?
Well, the first one is definitely, as I've mentioned a few times, recently I spoke with the Human Rights Special Rapporteur and in Afghanistan, and the main thing is for Afghans, specifically in the context of being able to share concerns, whether it's receiving humanitarian aid or humanitarian aid packages, corruption there, whether it's the scams that Karen was talking about, they need to feel that their stories and their reports are reaching those who can actually bring about change and can bring about accountability. And this is one of the main hindrances for Afghans to feel safe to share their stories and their concerns, because they feel like it is going into an echo chamber where by their stories and their experiences are not being collated in a way or recorded or monitored to actually ensure that change will come about. And that's why, especially in my work, when it comes to collating not only human rights violations, but city service issues and security concerns, is what will happen to my report, who will see this, and what change can come about. And not only in the Afghan context, and I'm sure that other panelists may also sense this, is that in countries like Afghanistan, that extra step usually is missing, where the framework and the benchmarks are set in place to for those to share their experiences or to be interviewed, but for them themselves, the communities, they feel like it's just become another a data point or a data set where it's being used for the benefit of those perhaps who are collating the reports, but actually not seeing any constructive response. So that's, I would say, for me and my work, has been a great hindrance in obtaining trust, is what will you do with my information, and how can you ensure to me that the change that I wish to see will come about. And that's a conversation that as humanitarianists and those who are working in these specific fields need to engage in. Is one is monitoring, but what about the next step?
If I could, and that's a great contribution, thank you, Sarah. If I could sort of develop those ideas about trust and accountability. So obviously after a situation like Afghanistan or currently in the Ukraine, what we need to do is also document human rights abuses. And there's a lot of debate at the moment about using things like social media, YouTube videos, etc. And there are academic teams at various universities around the world who use student clinics to verify some of that information. So one of the dangers is that then we have some sort of report which documents, or the sharing of a YouTube video. If that's used for international criminal law trials, we have to ensure that that information and that video, all the data is verified. And of course, with the advent of things like deep fakes and the technological ability for people to manipulate data, to manipulate YouTube videos, and indeed to hack into Twitter or Telegram or whatever other technology is used by refugees. So the post-humanitarian intervention in terms of accountability also has to be I guess, monitored to ensure that that data is verified.
Thanks, Maria. And I'll build on that as well. I think another point when we're talking about accountability as well is to think about how the sort of the data that is being collected, that is being used for reports, how that also very easily spread across from, say, a UN entity to other sort of private actors as well. So looking at the sort of public-private partnerships, and there have been various sort of controversies around that in the past. A few years ago, the UN, I think, World Food Programme partnering with a private organization, and there were issues about sort of the security of that data, what it was being used for, etc., and sort of the lack of transparency. So I think also extending that question of accountability also to the sort of the private sphere and the actors that are involved, and how to hold them accountable as well in terms of their data management and the usage of data as well, being important, so that the information doesn't continue on and continues to spread. And then also we have the issue, of course, of consent. What has someone consented to when giving up their data? So yeah, really important accountability points there as well.
And just to jump in here, how do we prevent this from happening? How do we increase accountability? Is it increasing transparency? Is it having some overarching guidelines, or if anyone has any ideas here?
Yeah, I think with the UN High Commissioner of Refugees, I think they are developing, well, they've got an approach, obviously, and particularly with a cohort who are particularly vulnerable, like refugees. It's important to have guidelines to know that you need to be clear about explaining the privacy implications and what the data is going to be used. So, for example, just broadly speaking, in the refugee context, there are guidelines about how to deal with particularly vulnerable cohorts, knowing, for example, that if they've come from traumatized backgrounds, they may not fully understand what is, they've just come off a boat. They may not really fully understand the things that are being told to them because they're traumatized. So, for example, you might need to wait a couple of days before you tell them about what's happening with their digital identity. So there are various screening mechanisms more generally about dealing with vulnerable populations, which I think are enhanced in the digital sphere. So some work has been done in international organisations, but I think further work does have to be done about the digital risks.
I think here it'd be great to hear from you, Johannes, about the African Human Rights Framework, because I think that's some really interesting developments happening there, especially. So it'd be, really interesting to hear on that.
Yeah, thank you, Karin. In relation to accountability, I think we could think of also the accountability or the responsibility of companies or private actors as well, like in the process of this humanitarianism or solidarity as well. So accountability is a broad and vague concept, but it may embrace like judicial accountability or quasi-judicial accountability, or it might be kind of remedies like through restitution or kind of damages. So it could be criminal or civil, but at the same time, more specifically under the African human rights system, we have regional mechanisms for violations of human rights abuses. So I think there are some courts at regional level as well as at sub-regional level as well. The most interesting and unique aspect of the African system is that we have around 5 sub-regional economic communities. Basically, they were created for sub-regional integration, but they end up also in handling human rights cases. So victims of human rights violation or abuse can vindicate their rights before these bodies. For instance, the ECOWAS Community Court of Justice has recently made interesting pronouncements on freedom of expression on the internet. For example, in 2017, the Togolese government was shutting down the internet and entirely blocking the population from accessing the internet. And the court said blocking or shutting down the internet violates or chills freedom of expression on the internet. So this is important to foster freedom of expression on the internet as well as in the digital ecosystem. Similarly, in the East Africa, we have East African Court of Justice. So the East African Court of Justice has also made important pronouncements that decriminalizes sedition and criminal defamation acts from Tanzania as well as Burundi. At the regional level also, we have some interesting decisions before the African Court on Human and People's Rights, such as in the Konate case and the Konate versus Burkina Faso case, the African Court found that criminal defamation or sedition laws have a chilling effect on journalists' exercise of freedom of expression. So this all may entail freedom of expression in the digital age. So very recently, the African Commission also adopted a declaration on freedom of expression and access to information in Africa. Especially Principle 5 of the declaration made it clear that the same right people have offline must be exercised online. So this is important development in terms of ushering and protecting freedom of expression as well as privacy and other civil and political rights on the internet, including solidarity as well.
Can I just reflect upon that in terms of Johannes, what about the right to be anonymous? Because sometimes in my area, such as refugee law, it's important for refugees sometimes to be under the radar, to stay out of state accountability. So, and that's been sort of litigated in the moment, even in Australia, this idea that almost do people have a right not to have a digital identity, to not be identified? Is there anything in your area that you know of in terms of freedom of expression?
Well, on the issue of anonymity, again, we have some normative guidance from the African Commission, especially in the 2019 African Commission Declaration. It made it clear that individuals have the right to be anonymous. So that's one important safeguard, to protect privacy. But at the same time, we need to also balance, people's access to information. If it's for the sake of, general public's interest, sometimes it could be compromised. And most importantly, in the African human rights system, one of the unique aspects is that there is a concept of duties, and I will explain later. Even the concept of solidarity is considered as both a right as well as a duty. So with that, we need to strike a balance between these competing demands.
And just one last thing, when we talk about humanitarianism, there's quite controversial movements in Italy to actually criminalize the assistance that NGOs, so civil society, give to refugees, and it's very controversial. But yeah, that's another reason I'm mentioning anonymity, because if the state can track the way the civil society is helping refugees, and it's primarily the rescue of boats, but also facilitating the movement of refugees, then that's I guess a risk again of the digital sphere and humanitarianism. I think a lot of us think about humanitarianism being international organizations, particularly in Europe, and also in the US with helping refugees. It can often be individuals and civil society giving humanitarian aid.
So we'd just like to oh, sorry.
You go.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to say, actually, Maria, I think it's really important to bring up what's sometimes called solidarity crimes, so criminalizing humanitarian assistance. There's a lot of those type of criminalizations happening in Europe in particular that I'm aware of. You mentioned Italy, I think also in France, where there may be exceptions to certain rules in terms of assisting refugees, in terms of legal entry requirements. There might be exceptions, but they might not be very broad, and so humanitarian acts could still fall within those. There is a really interesting case, not relating to the digital sphere, but case at the French constitutional courts, which the independent expert on human rights and solidarity has referred to, in his work, whereby the principle of fraternité, or somewhat similar to solidarity, was actually used as a defense mechanism to free someone who was being prosecuted for assisting refugees to enter France. So really interesting how actually very concretely solidarity could make a difference, because often I think it's seen as something very vague. And so if we're talking about development of human rights law, for example, and having what's sometimes known as third generation rights or sort of solidarity rights, is sort of very broad concepts of solidarity or development, healthy environment. They're actually very specific things that could be litigated even in relation to those sort of vague concepts. So yeah, worth keeping in mind. Sorry.
Thanks, Karen. I was just going to remind everyone who's listening that the chat box is open and we'd love to hear from you. So by all means, post your questions or interventions, and we'd love to include those in the conversation. But I guess while we're waiting for that, the conversation continues. One thing that's really emerged is how many different jurisdictions and different scales of political institutions are engaged in discussion around these issues. There's obviously a lot of commonalities, but important differences. And I think in the tech domain, tech developers often tend to transport techniques and code that's been used in one setting to another, and use this worked there, so we'll use it for the basis for what we're going to try and achieve here. So speaking to an imagined audience of tech developers, what are the most important differences that you think tech developers need to be more mindful of, based on what you know of your various, and you know so much about the various jurisdictions and settings in which you're working?
I can just answer this from my own experience, but I've come upon this many times, this example of carbon copying different types of projects and bringing them to other parts of the world, and both the pros and the cons. And an example that I've brought up multiple times is a USA project which took an application that was based in Colombia and Venezuela and brought to Afghanistan. And the project was aimed to provide an application where users could send in issues that they had with city officials, whether it was their response to emergency crises, city services such as sanitation, electricity, and there would be a conversation that would go on with the user and the city official. And that project collapsed within a week of launching because, number one, the sample size was so small. It was from a very, very niche group within Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. And there was just a culmination of issues in the planning of that application, in the sense that it was literally a copy paste from the South American context, and there was just so many problems with that application that it was just not useful. And within a week, that project collapsed. And one would say that whether it's worked here and the South American context could essentially be near to the Afghan context, and I think that that's a very knee-jerk and a very elementary assumption. But also, why is it that we aren't taking these extra steps in human-centered design and ensuring that the user is put in first before the benchmarks of a project and the outputs that we wish to see? Because when you're going in and you're just trying to meet the very basic requirements, the sustainability of these projects is just, it goes out the window. And projects which could actually be quite impactful aren't. And another one is that usually these applications or these tech solutions are designed without the involvement of host communities. And I've seen this time and time again in Afghanistan as well, is that an application will be designed by a fully European, a fully American team with one translator who speaks both languages, Dari and Pashtun, in the Afghan context, and that's really the limit of the use of the host community. The developers aren't Afghan, the researchers aren't Afghan, the data analysts aren't Afghan, and you know, it's completely
off the point, really. It's just unable to meet the demands of the community. So these are the 2 points that I've come across when not only analyzing these tech solutions, but also seeing the aftermath and how detrimental they can be.
Thanks, Sarah. Anyone else want to come in on this?
Yeah, if I could talk to that, I mean, there's a whole debate about who's actually making apps. You know, Silicon Valley, I would posit, has been criticized for the makeup of the, you know, to be blunt, they are young white males making this tech. And I know that's simplistic, but I think I'm not the only one to recognize that. The debate about refugee-led policies and designs has been something that has been talked about in recent years, and it applies to the digital and non-digital sphere. So the idea that policies should be informed by refugee experience. So we should have refugees included in UN decision-making, for instance. And if I could just reflect on the really great points made by Sarah, one of the things as a human rights lawyer that I often talk about is human rights by design. So the idea that the app is actually developed with human rights in mind, rather than being put into a country like Afghanistan and then human rights abuses starting or concerns. So we also talk about privacy by design too, again, to think about when the app or the technology is being developed, to think ahead about the privacy implications. So I would say when we're designing these technologies or the digital identity apps, that we need to look at cultural sensitivities, we need to look at refugees' lived experience, so the fact that they are coming from places of conflict and will have trauma. And then lastly, if I could just flag the criticism of technology in terms of racial issues. We know, for example, that face recognition has significant problems in terms of racial bias, and that has to be considered as well when we're talking about digital identity, particularly in countries like Afghanistan or with refugee cohorts.
Thanks, Maria. Johannes and Karen's, any differences that tech developers should be mindful of based on your experience?
In terms of platforms and non-state actors, I think they should be abide by human rights principles, and also they need to acknowledge and uphold the interests of people in the global south, especially as Professor Maria earlier mentioned. There is algorithmic bias as well as during content moderation. There are kind of bias in moderating or take down content, so that needs to be corrected. So platforms or app developers should also uphold the interest of marginalized communities, and also the interests of those communities who needs to be protected, and also in relation to content moderation in recent times, for example, social media platforms like Facebook, where muzzling contents from Palestine or contents that amplify the voices of marginalized communities. So this needs to be rectified, I think, because at some point whenever tech platforms make decisions, they need to take the interests of global south as well, and also they need to kind of hire enough staff that could help protect those people from the global south and unrepresented communities. Yeah, these are some of my points.
That's a great point, Johannes. And yeah, we often think of social media, as I said, it can be a platform for communities to from the ground up, develop solidarities, but it can also be used, particularly social media, as an agent of persecution, as an agent of human rights abuses. So yeah, content moderation, as Johannes said, is terribly important.
Just on that note of ground up solidarity and grassroots fostering of solidarity, we have a couple of questions coming in about how to support women on the ground who might want to get involved in solidarity or feel more global solidarity with the problems that they're facing, particularly through funding and things like that. So I was wondering if any of our speakers have any suggestions for how people can get involved in work in digital humanitarian initiatives and in solidarity and funding opportunities as well. Any sort of practical grassroots ways people can get involved?
Well, I can just share one experience. I think the first thing, especially when getting involved in these types of sectors, is to understand the work that you're about to engage in. It's quite easy to involve yourself, but it's much more difficult to understand the context, and that takes investment of time and also a great deal of empathy, because usually these concepts are quite complex. So one is acquiring that knowledge, and also finding a very robust network within that host community which you are working with. One is experts, obviously, wherever in the world they are, but also complementing that by engaging with those and listening very deeply to the host communities that you wish to work with, because it's very easy to tell people what you think based on your knowledge and your expertise, but it's something else to sit there and really listen and provide agency for those who are struggling in whichever sector that you're passionate about, and then come back to the drawing table about approaching solutions. And these are, I think, the two that have supported me personally when it comes to approaching tech solutions, when it comes to civic engagement or accountability, transparency, and connecting the citizenry to whether it's city officials or government officials, is first ensuring that they are at the helm of the design process, and ensuring that when you have these testing groups or surveys, that they are the crux and all of the design comes after that, because usually when you design something and the problem is at the helm rather than the lived experiences we've talked about in this panel, it can be very detrimental. This is not a product. You're not selling something. And that's sometimes with developers coming back to how can we approach development of these types of solutions equitably, is you can't approach this as something that requires just funding or requires a sustainability, a profit model, because that's just not going to work. So on top of that is finding funders and finding those who can support you, who aren't looking for an immediate output. Change comes incremental, especially when it involves lived experience. You can't just put numbers on it and specific benchmarks, because that's just not how lived experience works. So understanding the environment that you're working in, ensuring that you have that collective group around you and listening, and then coming back to the design process is I think one of the ways that you can get involved and know that your involvement is actually going to do something.
Thanks so much, Sarah. If no one else wants to jump in, it might be a good opportunity to wrap up with one final question. We've talked about a lot of different strategies for enhancing or protecting solidarity, but in each of your respective contexts, I'm wondering what you have found to be the most important strategies for positively promoting and harnessing solidarity in digital environments going forward. I might start with Karen.
Sure. Thanks, Maddie. Yeah, so I think in terms of, so I'll just speak in terms of the conceptual and institutional development of this concept of solidarity in the digital age. I think a really important starting point is recognizing the unique challenges that we've talked about in this panel for solidarity, specifically in the digital age. So recognizing that that's different, both the potential, but I think specifically that challenges is really important. And also that this is kept in mind by all different actors. So not leaving out, say, private companies. I think they're a huge role to play, not just as a potential risk, but I think also as enablers as well of solidarity in the digital context, for sure. So should not be left out. So if we're talking about a human rights framework, really important to move beyond the sort of state-centric model of design. Then if I may just two more points, I think, as well. I think there needs to be continuous research into the impact of the digital sphere upon identity formation, and how that links to the emergence or perhaps prevention of solidarities that further or at least align with human rights. And then I think, just as I mentioned, the non-state actors have a really key role to play as well. And their duties and obligations, I think, need to be much more clearly defined. And also the duties of the states to regulate those companies. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Maria, do you have any thoughts before we finish up, which is the most important strategy?
I think the most important thing is consciousness raising. So the refugee issue can sometimes fall off the radar. Obviously, with the Ukrainian situation, that's quite different. So just speaking from the Australian experience, we have offshore detention centres and also detention, particularly in hotels, which has been controversial in Australia. So these are asylum seekers and refugees detained. And one of the great ways that technology can be used is to document that and get solidarity from civil society and also people internationally. So for example, we had the infamous Park Hotel, which is still operating. And the use of technology means that people held in those detention centres, if they are able to keep their phone, can document some of the human rights abuses or inhumane treatment. And so that, for me, in terms of consciousness raising, has been one of the great things about the use of technology.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Maria. And Johannes and Sarah, do you have any final comments here?
Thank you. In terms of promoting solidarity, I think we need to study or codify, the norms of solidarity at the global level or at regional level. Importantly, it should be recalled, for instance, in context of South Africa during apartheid era, the ideals of Ubuntu helped them, resolve their long-standing differences. So the idea of solidarity is important in post-conflict societies in Africa or in Afghanistan or elsewhere. So I think the contribution of solidarity or humanitarianism needs to be studied. This might be related with ongoing or the current study by the UN Independent Special Rapporteur on solidarity. And the second point is social media platforms or non-state actors also needs to be involved in this field as well. For instance, in recent times, in Arab Spring, as well as in recent Nigerian protest, there is IndSARS hashtag. The IndSARS movement was like to protest the brutality of police in Nigeria. So platforms have a role in amplifying such kind of voices to oppose a kind of governmental policy. So such points needs to be strengthened. And the other final quick points are we need also to bring cases of humanitarianism or solidarity before courts, and courts need to give kind of pronouncements about these rights, and if these rights are judicially protected, and we have a clear roadmap about the realization of these rights. And finally, promoting solidarity requires international cooperation as provided in the principles of the United Nations. So we need to give a kind of development assistance as well as technical assistance for global south, as well as those countries that have suffered from colonialism and apartheid, something like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Johannes. And Sarah, one word with 1 minute left. What would you do?
I would just like to echo what Karen said. about, I'll just say with the private companies, it's not us and them. And I think this is a mistake that we make, especially working in humanitarianism. It needs to be a collective response, and instead of othering, we can work together. It takes time, but it'll be important for sustainability measures. So I'll leave it at that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. So I'll bring this talk to an end. It's been fascinating and enlightening discussion, and I hope our audience feels the same. I think I've been particularly struck by the challenges we face in supporting solidarity globally, but also how this concept of solidarity and humanitarianism is more important than ever in the digital age. And I hope this is something we can keep in mind in our various lines of work or life as we go forward. Of course, if you have any further thoughts or actions on this topic, please feel free to get in touch with Johannes or Karen if you're interested in continuing the conversation, and you can find their emails in their rights bios. Please also keep an eye out for a blog symposium that Karen and Johannes are planning, continuing on this theme of solidarity under international law. Thank you again to our speakers and my co-chair for a wonderful session, and thank you to our participants for attending. We hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.